Welcome, everyone, and thanks so much for joining us today. We're very grateful to have Rob Van Hille here from the Moss Group, who's going to be talking to us today about bioplastic and learn a bit about the difference between bio-based plastics, biodegradable plastics, whether they are in fact a good idea, as well as many other questions, I'm sure.
So yeah, thanks so much, Tara, and thanks for giving me the opportunity to talk about biodegradable and compostable plastics and bioplastics generally. It's a subject that's very close to my heart, but it's also, yeah, it's a subject that has a lot of there's a lot of information around it. There's a lot of uncertainty around what the terms mean, where they fit in, and how these things should or should not be introduced into the South African marketplace. So yeah, essentially, there's been a global backlash against plastics and particularly plastics in the environment over the last couple of years, and this has driven a desire to reduce the impact that plastics have on the environment and to look for alternative materials. And the bioplastics are one of those alternative materials. So you've probably seen some of these items in your supermarkets or on the shelves or on internet sites that are selling these types of materials. Often they say it's not made of plastic or this is not plastic, but that in itself is not really true. So if you look at the actual definition of what a plastic is, it's a synthetic material that's made from a wide range of organic polymers. It can be molded into shape while soft and then set into a rigid or slightly elastic form. So these bioplastic bags or PLA bottles, etc., they're all still plastics. They're just different types of plastics. So even from this very early, in the first slide, it highlights the fact that there needs to be clear and consistent messaging. There needs to be meaningful consumer education from both the people who put these products on the market and the brand owners who use them, because these materials, just like normal plastics, they need to be responsibly introduced and managed. Otherwise, they can become as much of a problem as the traditional plastics. Okay, so I have to start with a little bit of chemistry and just some basics to understand a little bit about plastics. So with normal plastics, you've often seen, if you've looked on a cool drink bottle or a bag or something, you'll see the little triangle with a number in it. That number is the polymer code, and it refers to the material that plastic is made of. So plastics are polymers, and a polymer is something that's, it consists of a series of repeating molecules, and those individual things that make up a polymer are called monomers, and those are normally small, low molecular weight substances. So if you look at the information on the bottom, this is basically what goes into PET, so what most of your cool drink bottles are made of, and it's made from two raw materials. Okay, that the terephthalic acid, the first component, that's derived from crude oil, and the second one, monoethylene glycol, that's derived from gas, from natural gas. And when you put those two together at that ratio, you get this PET monomer, and when you put a lot of those together, you get the polymer, the plastic, that then gets used to make bottles and a variety of other things. So yeah, just the important thing to remember is that plastics are made up of lots and lots of repeating units of individual small molecules. So when you talk about a bio-based polymer, so most plastics are derived from fossil fuels, but it is also possible to make these building blocks that go into plastic from natural raw materials, so plant-based materials. So a bio-based polymer is basically, it's a plastic polymer that's derived from a renewable, typically a plant-based source. These may be identical to the fossil fuel-based polymers. So bio-PET, for instance, is chemically exactly the same as fossil fuel-based PET. Or they may be completely different polymers. So things like polylactic acid, which is another type of plastic, but it doesn't have a fossil fuel-based analog. So it's only made from plant-based materials. So looking back at this example of PET, you've probably seen this Velpre plant bottle, and it says up to 30% made from plants. It's 100% recyclable as before. And how they get to that 30% is basically this component B. Instead of coming from ethylene from natural gas, it comes by a process where sugarcane is converted to ethanol. That ethanol is converted to the monoethylene glycol, and that then is used as a component for making the PET bottle. So this plant bottle is 30% plant-based. Coke has experimented with a bottle that is 100% plant-based, and basically it's still the same PET molecule, except now both component A and component B have been made from plant-based materials. So you still got exactly the same Coke bottle. It behaves, it has all the same properties as a normal fossil fuel-based Coke bottle. It can be recycled the same way a normal bottle is. It's just that the raw materials that were used to make it are plant-based. Okay, so what does biodegradable actually mean, and where do bioplastics fit into it? So a biodegradable material is one that degrades by biological activity, and that's important to remember, that it needs microorganisms, it needs bacteria and fungi to cause it to break down. Okay, it results in a specific change in the chemical structure. So even though, that polymeric structure, those polymers get broken down into the individual subunits, and those subunits then get degraded finally to produce a gas and water and some biomass. So if it's degraded aerobically, so in the presence of oxygen, the end products are carbon dioxide and water. And if it gets degraded anaerobically, it makes, so that's sort of in a landfill, for instance, where there isn't easy access to oxygen, it will make carbon dioxide and methane, water and biomass, and then some mineral components. So if you look at this diagram here that comes from the European Bioplastics Association, it basically looks at all the different polymers that are used to make plastics, and it breaks them into 4 quadrants based on whether or not they're bio-based or fossil fuel-based, or whether or not they're biodegradable or non-biodegradable. So in the bottom left corner, you've got the conventional plastics, so PET, the bottles, polypropylene, which is things like a lot of your some tubs and the woven bags and stuff that you get, and polyethylene, so that's things like milk bottles, shampoo bottles, those types of things. So those plastics are made from fossil fuel sources, and they're non-biodegradable. If you look at the top left corner, there you've got those same plastics, except they, instead of being made from the fossil fuel raw materials, they're made from bio-based raw materials. And they have the same properties. They're still not biodegradable, but they can be recycled along with their traditional fossil fuel-based cousins. On the top left corner are bio-based biodegradable plastics, and that's when most people talk about bioplastics, they're talking about these things. So they're made from plant-based raw materials, and they're biodegradable. And these are things like PLA, which is polylactic acid, and some other acronyms that have long chemical structures. And you get these starch-based mixtures as well. And then it is also possible to make materials that can biodegrade purely from fossil fuels. And some examples of those are at the bottom. So yeah, important to remember that a biodegradable plastic can be fossil fuel-based, or it can be bio-based, but you can also get bio-based non-biodegradable plastics. So yeah, it's quite a confusing space. Okay, and then to make things even more complicated, you can get additives that you can add to normal plastics that the manufacturers claim to make these traditional plastics biodegradable. And these come in 2 forms. The ones that are most common are things that are oxodegradable plastics, and they have an additive that gets included in the plastic mix in a small amount. And what it does is it makes sites within that plastic chain that are susceptible to chemical reactions. And normally they're induced by sunlight, oxygen, and that causes that plastic to become brittle and to fragment into lots of tiny little pieces. The claim then is that those tiny little plastic fragments are able to be biodegraded by bacteria and fungus, and they will end up as carbon dioxide and biomass. So these traditional plastics with additives are a very contentious subject. There are a lot of multinational organizations, some countries, and NGOs like the Ellen MacArthur Foundation and others that have campaigned to have these things banned in their entirety. The claims of full biodegradability are contentious. So it's, and I know the South African Plastics Pact has oxodegradable plastics on their initial list of problematic plastics that they're hoping to have phased out in South Africa by next year. So yeah, that's just one more level of complexity that can be added to the space. Okay, so then there's another differentiator, and that's between something that's biodegradable and something that's compostable. And the main difference between the two is that compostable materials have a specific time frame that's associated with their degradation. So you can have a material that biodegrades, but it may take years to biodegrade. A compostable material has to break down in an aerobic composting process, so not in a landfill, through the action of naturally occurring microorganisms. It has to do it to a high extent, so it's typically over 80 or 90% that it has to be degraded, and it has to be done within a specific time frame. And that's the most important thing. So to be certified as compostable, that degradation has to happen within a specific time. Even within compostable, there are subcategories. So some materials will be classified as industrially compostable, and that means that they break down under controlled conditions, and it's typically at high temperature, so between 50 and 70 degrees. They need forced aeration, so they've either got to be turned regularly or they're in special equipment that gets actively aerated, and there needs to be managed humidity. So this is normally done in an industrial composting facility. There are a limited number of industrial composting facilities available in South Africa. The picture, that picture with the machine that's taken at an industrial composting facility outside Paarl in the Western Cape, probably the biggest one in South Africa, but there are a small number of these facilities in the country. Home composting, again, refers to the breakdown of a biodegradable material under conditions that you'd find in a home compost heap. So that's lower temperature, it's without active turning, etc. So there are a number of international certification agencies, so TUV, DIN, the European Combustibles Association, or the Australian ones, and they will test these materials under the specific control conditions in the laboratory. And if the material passes, they can then show the certification on it. Okay, the important thing to remember is that several bioplastics, including PLA, which is the most common one in South Africa, are not home compostable. So if you put it in your home compost heap, it will eventually break down, but it won't break down within the time frame that is specified for it to be certified as home compostable. So if you put them in your compost heap and you dig it up after a couple of months, you probably will still see fragments of plastic or straw, etc. Okay, so these standards for compostability aren't just dished out very easily. So to get certification for compostability, there are a number of standards around the world. So ASTM is the American one. There is a SAN standard, a South African standard. There's an EN standard, a European one. But basically, they're all very similar according to what the material, the test that the material has to pass. So the first one looks at disintegration. And it says that after 84 days under these conditions, less than 10% of the original mass can be in particles bigger than 2 millimeters. So basically, that's just saying that within that time frame, this material has to have fragmented into lots of tiny little pieces. Okay, the next one is biodegradation. And this is measured by the amount of carbon dioxide that's given off relative to the amount of carbon that was in the material originally. So you have these sort of special vessels and you measure the gas that comes off, and after 45 days at 58 degrees, so this is an industrial composting standard, 90% of that carbon needs to have been turned into carbon dioxide. Okay, the third one is terrestrial safety, and that's basically the test to make sure that this material doesn't have any nasty metals that sometimes get used in the dyes or can be used to give the plastic specific properties. So there are standards for sludges and compost, and when these certified materials degrade, the metals that they give off have to be less than 50% of what's specified in those standards. And then the final test is a seed germination test. So you've got to take that end product compost and you've got to run a set of trials with at least 2 species with a control that's a normal compost that doesn't include the biodegraded plastic in it. And basically your germination rate has to be greater than 90% of your control. So this test makes sure that there's no toxic residues or nothing in that degraded material that affects seed germination. So only if your material passes all 4 of those tests can it get a compostability standard. Okay, so obviously if you look at everything that needs to go into it, and it has to be done in triplicate, etc., certification is rigorous, it's time consuming, and it's expensive. And up until very recently, there weren't any facilities in South Africa that were accredited to do this certification. So it had to be done overseas, which made it even more expensive. But recently, the CSIR has set up a laboratory that's able to do testing for compostability in South Africa. So that should hopefully reduce the cost of certification a bit going forward. Okay, but this is the thing is, and this is a critical thing, compostable plastics still need to end up in the right place. So yeah, this picture comes from the marketing material of a company that sells compostable products in South Africa. The thing is, a material that's certified as industrially compostable, it needs the right temperature, and particularly it needs a high concentration of the right type of bacteria and fungi for it to degrade. And those bacteria occur in high concentrations in the compost heap. They don't occur in high concentrations against a fence, in a tree, in the sea, in a river. So something like PLA, there's been a lot of academic research done, and if a PLA straw or a PLA bag ends up in the sea, it can take years and years before it breaks down. So it's as likely to strangle a bird or be swallowed by a turtle. There's still a high chance of that. So, critically important, just because something is certified as compostable, it doesn't mean it can just be thrown into the environment and you can forget about it. It needs to get into the right place for it to behave the way it was designed to behave. Okay, so then moving on from sort of the basics of what's compostable and what's biodegradable, how big is this market globally? So this is information from the European Bioplastics Association. And basically they estimate that the total global market for bioplastics at the moment is about just over 2 million tons. And about 40% of that is bio-based, non-biodegradable materials. So that's traditional plastics that have been made using a plant-based raw materials. And then about 60% are biodegradable. And the biggest contributor to that is PLA, polylactic acid, and then these starch blends. But to put it in the context of how big is this relative to the normal plastic sector, the traditional fossil fuel-based plastic sector, it accounts for less than 0.5%. So for traditional plastics, production in 2020 was 367 million tons. So it's still very small. One of the concerns that have been raised around bioplastics and plant-based plastics is, are they a threat to food security? And it's the same argument that people have had with biofuels. South Africa, for instance, there was a regulation that said you couldn't use food crops to produce biofuel. So even if we had a bumper maize crop and there was excess maize, that couldn't be turned into bioethanol, for instance. But if you look at the current size of the bioplastics market, it's estimated that about 0.7 million hectares of arable land is used for bioplastics. But the market is small, so the amount of land that's used small. But if you extrapolate the relative proportion of bioplastics to total plastics, that's about how much arable land would be needed if all 367 million tons of plastic were produced from plant-based materials. So I think the argument that bioplastics compete with or affect food security, that's probably not the strongest argument against bioplastics. So if that's the case, why aren't there more bioplastics? And I think that the important thing to understand is that bioplastics don't grow on trees, and they don't easily come from crab shells or any of the other waste materials that you may have seen clips on YouTube or Facebook saying that the student in whatever university has developed a miracle bioplastic from fish scales or something. So, I mean, there's been a lot of research into what non-food raw materials can be used for bioplastics, but you need to understand that this has to happen at scale, and the process of going from a raw material to a bioplastic is actually very complicated, and it's a multi-stage chemical process. So again, looking at PLA, polylactic acid, the most common bioplastic, you start out with a raw material, and it's normally sugar-based. That has to be fermented in big biological fermenters. You get lactic acid produced, but then also a whole host of other biological molecules. So the first thing you need to do is purify that lactic acid out. That involves a whole lot of industrial steps too. Once you get the pure lactic acid, it's got to go through a series of chemical reactions to get to the next important product, lactide. That then needs to go through another set of chemical reactions to open it up and eventually to make the resin. And the resin looks a lot like a normal plastic resin, but it's done in big factories like the one you see at the bottom. So yeah, and it's expensive. So at the moment, most bioplastics cost about 2 to 3 times more than the types of fossil fuel-based plastics that they're designed to replace. So it's, yeah, when you see people saying we need to ban plastics and you can replace everything with hemp, it's not as easy as that. The other thing is, at the moment in South Africa, there's no commercial scale production of bioplastic resins. So all the bioplastics that you see on the market here, it's either resin that's been imported from overseas that converters have turned into the end products locally, or it's fully imported end products. We do have a big sugar sector in South Africa, and the sugar sector is looking at ways that they can diversify out of cane sugar because of all the health concerns around that. So we may get to a stage in the future where we're able to produce these bioplastic resins in South Africa from a sugarcane based raw material, and that then may make them slightly more economically competitive relative to the fossil fuel plastics. Okay, the next big question is, are bioplastics a good thing? And here we need to look at eco-design and fit for purpose. And these are concepts that are as important for normal plastics as they are for bioplastics. But if you look at what are the core design requirements for a packaging or a product, first of all, there needs to be product protection. So if it's a bottle for water, or it's a bottle for a cool drink, or it's a bag for putting something in, it needs to do its job to protect the insides. It then needs to be correctly designed for the usage that it's intended for. So if you look at, for instance, a bottle that has fabric softener in it, for instance, you want that cap to be designed in such a way that it's a useful measure for one dose or something, or if it's a powder, that it's got a nozzle that allows it to be poured, or if it's a liquid soap, that it's got the right type of sort of push button dispenser. So you want to design this product so that it can be used properly. It needs to contain all the necessary information. So that's the health and safety stuff, but also information around how it should be managed at end of life, how it should be disposed. If it's recyclable, are different components recyclable or not recyclable? Do you need to take the lids off, etc.? And then obviously there's a marketing component to it. So if this material or product has advantages over the things that it's meant to replace, then you can get some marketing traction out of that. Okay, so that's the core design requirements. Add on to that is the raw material. So is it fossil fuel based? If it's bio-based, does that have additional advantages, as long as it doesn't impact on what it actually needs to do? So that's what goes into eco-design or fit-for-purpose design. But in South Africa, and particularly with the legislation that's coming into effect on Friday around extended producer responsibility, where producers need to take responsibility for their product all the way to its final end of life, there's a lot more that needs to be considered when you're making decisions around both material, but also what these things look like. So you need to consider its next and end of life requirements. So what happens to it when you finish using it, whether it's a bioplastic bottle or a normal bottle? It needs to be collected. It needs to be sorted from other things. So if it's recyclable, it needs to be sorted from the non-recyclable stuff. Can it be reused or repurposed? Is it a tub that once you've eaten your food out of it, you can use it to grow plants or something like that? Can it be recycled? And then if it can't be recycled, what is its end of life? So a truly eco-designed product needs to take all this into account, and it needs to be it needs to be done within the context of the country that it's being done in. So for instance, in South Africa, there's currently no real collection for biodegradable or compostable products. They're difficult to sort. There's no recycling capacity, so they would need to go to a composter. They don't have the intrinsic value that a normal plastic, that some plastic materials do, that can be recycled again. So there's a financial incentive for people to collect them and take them to recyclers. So all of that needs to be considered. So if we look at some examples of eco-design around bioplastics, and I go back to the plant bottle to start with. So yes, it has a potential advantage where you're transitioning from at least part of it from a fossil fuel-based plastic to a bio-based plastic, but it doesn't change, it's still PET, so it doesn't change the way it protects its contents. It doesn't affect its usage. The information is still the same. And because it's still a normal PET bottle, its whole post-life is the same as a normal PET bottle. But it gives the manufacturer or the brand owner an opportunity to get some marketing traction from it. But even in these cases, you need to consider the full life, the full product life cycle. So taking bio-PET as an example, because we can't make these resins locally, they start from sugarcane that's grown in Brazil. Brazil has a big sugarcane to ethanol industry. So that sugarcane is fermented and it's turned into ethanol. That ethanol then gets shipped to India, where it gets converted by a chemical process from ethanol to monoethylene glycol, which was component B in PET. That then gets shipped to South Africa, where it's mixed with component A, and it's made into the PET resin that then goes to the bottle. So if you're looking at it from a true sustainability perspective, you need to look at the full life cycle of it. And I think there needs to be authentic storytelling around these green products. Okay, so that's the one example. The next one, which is sometimes a pet peeve of mine, is compostable dog poo bags. Okay, so it ticks a box from the raw material perspective, because they are made from plant-based materials. At the moment, there isn't collection and separation of these things, so it's very important that they need to get to where they're meant to go. The information around them, there's all sorts of claims and marketing, etc., which often isn't accurate. And what there lacks is real consumer education around how these products should be properly managed. So I live close to a forest where a lot of people walk their dogs, and this is the type of thing that you see. So taking your dog poo and putting it in a compostable bag and leaving it in the forest serves no purpose at all. You basically created a barrier that stops the dung beetles and the bacteria and the fungus from breaking that dog poo down faster than they would normally if it wasn't in a bag. And yeah, if these bags are industrially compostable, they're actually going to take a longer time to break down. Then if people think they're being responsible and they take their bag and they drop it in the bin at the edge of the forest, or when the bin's full, they just leave it next to the bin, all that material is going to end up in landfill. So the fact that it's a compostable bag, once it ends up in landfill, it's potentially worse than a normal plastic bag ending up in landfill, because if it breaks down under anaerobic conditions, it releases methane, which is a far more serious greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide. So from an eco-design perspective, this compostable bag is only fit for purpose if you use it, and once you've got your dog poo in it, you take it home and you put it in your compost heap, or it finds its way into a composting facility. If it's just left in the environment, or it ends up in landfill, it's no better than a normal plastic bag. In some cases, it's even worse. Okay, but there are more appropriate applications for compostable products. So one of them would be with packaging that comes into contact with food. So if you buy a chicken or meat from a supermarket, often it comes in a tray, and that tray normally is polystyrene or some sort of thermoform plastic, and often it has cling wrap over it. So when you get home and you take your chicken or your meat out, that packaging is then contaminated. It's very unlikely to be recycled. So if you put it in your bin, it's likely to end up in landfill. These types of things, if they were made from a compostable product and they were disposed of with your kitchen waste or your organic waste, and it ends up at a composting facility, that's much better than if it was traditional plastics and they ended up in landfill. Similarly, for compostable bags that you put your food waste in, and they then end up either in your home compost heap or at an industrial composting facility, that allows you to keep your wet food waste separate, to tie it up so it's not messy in your house, and it's now in packaging that can degrade. Again, the last thing I want to talk about is what is the current legislative status for bioplastics and biodegradable and compostable materials in South Africa. So we have a SAN standard, which is specific for industrially compostable plastics. It's very similar to the international standards. It has the same requirements. At the moment, we're in the process of finalizing the SAN standard for home compostable materials. Again, it will be similar to international standards. Then there's also another voluntary SAN standard, 1728, and this is specific to the requirements for marking and identification of degradable products. It's a voluntary standard. It is very comprehensive in terms of labeling, but because it's voluntary, there are almost no products on the market in South Africa that actually meet all the requirements. So one of the important requirements, first up, is that it must have a polymer code on it. So the same as a normal plastic, where the triangle with 1 is for PET, for 2 is HDPE, etc. For anything that's not one of the 6 traditional plastics, it gets a 7 number on it. You've probably seen it for multi-layer things. It'll say 7 other. For a compostable product, it must say 7 and then PLA or whatever that material is. So that acronym. and then along with the appropriate wording, so whether it's compostable or whether it's biodegradable. So in that picture, this coffee cup lid, it adheres to those requirements. It's got the resin code, it says PLA, and it says compostable. The biodegradable bag, it has its international certifications on it that confirm that it is compostable, but it doesn't have a resin code on it, so you don't know what it's actually made of. And then that other, the home compostable bag, had none of that information on it. Okay, yeah, the next one, that it must have the appropriate international standards. So there, that the green bag does, and they need to be verified by accredited laboratories. So you can't just put your own thing on. In South Africa, sort of formed over the last year, we do have a Compostable Plastics Council, and one of the first things that they're aiming to do, because it's difficult to get materials accredited in South Africa, is they will independently verify all the international accreditations and then put their own stamp on it to say that this material has been checked. We're comfortable that it's not a fake compostable certificate. Okay, and then the last one is, well, the last couple are, if they're different components and one part of it is compostable, for instance, and another part is not, then there needs to be some messaging to say, separate the lid from the cup. So for instance, this mug and bean cup, it says 100% compostable, but often when you get the lid, if you check the resin code on it, the lid's still made of polystyrene. So you can't throw that whole thing, the cup and the lid, into a compost heap because the lid's non-degradable. The other thing that you shouldn't say is make vague, non-specific environmental claims on it. And this is one of the sort of most common things with green products, is on it will say earth friendly or earth safe, environmentally friendly. There's no way of verifying that, so those shouldn't be on it. So yeah, if the standard was adhered to uniformly and collectively by the brand owners who use these materials, a lot of that misinformation and confusion that surrounds these materials could be done away with. But because there are almost no products on the market that adhere to this voluntary standard in its entirety, you can pretty much still say whatever you like on a product and claim compostability, and there's no real consequence at this stage. So yeah, that's something that hopefully will change with the extended producer responsibility legislation. So finally, does this mean that biodegradable and compostable products are the answer? They are certainly better than traditional plastics when they end up in the environment. Traditional plastics can take centuries to degrade. If they have these extra additives in, they will fragment a whole lot faster, but no one's really sure if they will biodegrade fully as fast as as people claim they are. If they're biodegradable or compostable and they're certified, under control conditions in the right place, these materials will break down into relatively harmless components. But the big question mark is, outside of that specific environment, everywhere else, how do they perform? Because they're not certified as compostable in the ocean or in a river or in the terrestrial environment. That certification only covers very specific conditions. So I think the take-home message is, this is a growing market for bioplastics and compostable plastics, but they need to be fit for purpose, and they need to be responsibly managed in the same way that a normal recyclable plastic product is responsibly managed, so that A, they don't end up where they shouldn't be, and that they don't disrupt mechanical recycling streams. So in South Africa, PET bottles are highly recycled. A PLA bottle looks a lot like a PET bottle. It's very difficult for particularly a informal collector to distinguish between the two. If a PLA bottle ends up in a PET recycling stream, it has negative impact on the end product. So they need to be responsibly managed. And finally, they need to be subject to extended producer responsibility. And they are specifically mentioned in the legislation. There needs to be an EPR plan. There needs to be a levy paid for these materials. At the moment, the sector is still a long way from having a viable EPR plan in place, and that's something that needs to be looked at quite urgently. So yeah, hopefully that's been informative, and yeah, if there are any questions, I'd be happy to try and answer them now or offline later.
Thank you so much, Rob. That was really great and very interesting. I particularly like the bioplastics don't grow on trees. Yeah, thanks so much. I think it's a great way to sort of make it digestible when it is quite a complex topic and not a simple solution. I did just have a couple questions, and please, for all our attendees, you're welcome to send any questions through in the chat box or the Q&A box. But while you're coming up with those questions, Rob, can you tell us what are the ideal conditions for biodegradable plastics to biodegrade? Because you mentioned that it wouldn't necessarily break down at the same rate as compostable products.
Yeah, so I mean, I think for all these things, the most important thing is they need to have the right microorganisms in contact with them. A high concentration of microorganisms obviously make it go faster. Moisture is important, so in a very dry environment, they're unlikely to degrade quickly. And ideally, you want them to be breaking down aerobically rather than anaerobically, because you don't want them to break down to release methane. So they need to be in an environment that's got good exposure to oxygen. So again, deep in the ocean where there's very little oxygen, there's very little in the way of the correct microbes, and it's again the higher the temperature, the faster they break down. So deep sea where it's cold, there aren't the right microbes, there's not much oxygen. Some of the research that's been published shows that these biodegradable materials can last 20, 30 years. So it's, yeah, they need to ideally be in an environment where there are lots of bacteria, lots of moisture, nice temperature. So like a compost heap or an industrial composting facility.
Okay, and certainly sort of not the environment. I know.
No. So yeah, so yeah, I think it's a common misconception that if something is biodegradable or compostable, you've got license to chuck it out your window because it's going to break down in the environment. Sure. It can take a long time to do that, and while it's lying around, it can be eaten by animals. It can strangle animals. It can do a lot of the harm that normal plastic can do.
I mean, I'm sure even sort of your average botanist might say that while sort of an orange peel might be biodegradable, you still shouldn't leave it in a nature reserve where there are no oranges growing, because it doesn't necessarily break down into the same components. I see we have had a few other questions coming through here in the Q&A box. The first one says, is polyco the PRO that you register with?
For bio, so if you've got a bio-based polymer, so say you've got bio-PET, you would then register with PETCO, because even if it's bio-based, it's still the same polymer. If you've got a bioplastic and it's a compostable bioplastic, at the moment there aren't any PROs that will manage those materials, and that's one of the big risks to the sector in South Africa. I know they have had some discussions with some of the existing PROs to see if they would take on bioplastics, but because they have a very different end of life to a normal plastic, they can't be collected, they can't be mechanically recycled, they need to be separated, they need to get to a composting facility. The end of life management is very different. So I think ideally, either within one of the existing PROs would need to be sort of a dedicated sector that looks after bioplastics, that needs to put in place an EPR plan that can ensure that these materials are separated from the traditional plastics and that they're aggregated and they get to the right composting facility. Yeah, as I said, the sector in South Africa at the moment is quite small. It doesn't have a lot of resources. So we are working to try and get support from either multinationals who produce these materials, or yeah, some international NGO organizations to support the development of an EPR plan so that these materials can become legally compliant going forward. if there isn't an EPR plan, it will be interesting to see how DFFE treats them, because they would not be compliant with the Section 18 legislation.
Thanks, Rob. I see the next question is, thanks, Rob. Very interesting talk. What are the end products of degraded conventional plastics, for example, due to photo degradation? And how do these compare with those of compostable and biodegradable plastics? And is the main difference between the two the time that it takes to break down?
Yeah, so I mean, if you ultimately, in however many decades or centuries it takes for a traditional plastic to fully degrade, the end products will be the same. I mean, if you look at the structure of a polyethylene molecule, it's basically carbon and hydrogen with some other stuff. So ultimately, its degradation product will be carbon dioxide and water. The main concern really is the fragmentation can happen quite quickly. The actual it's difficult for microorganisms to attack that polymer structure. So they kind of have to slowly eat away at the ends. So you end up, once it's fragmented, you end up with microplastics. Microplastics, if they get ingested by invertebrates or fish and stuff like that, there's a lot of research that shows that they can be toxic to them. I think the other thing with traditional plastics, but it's also true to an extent with bioplastics, is there are often extra additives that are put into them to give them specific properties. So either to give them extra UV resistance to make them last longer, or to affect the elasticity or some of the mechanical properties. And those extra additives might contain metals, they might contain other things. Similarly, there is a move now towards plant-based inks, but historically a lot of the inks that were used to print on materials would have metals and other potentially toxic elements in it. So yeah, the ultimate end products are the same because the basic building blocks are similar, but it's, yeah, the differences come in, are there additives, and then how long it takes to break down. And I think for those microplastic fragments to fully degrade can take a very long time.
So even if something is certified as biodegradable, it doesn't necessarily mean there will either of those two products would biodegrade in the same way. One could break down faster into sort of carbon and hydrogen, and the other one might break down into microplastics.
Yeah. So something that's certified biodegradable doesn't have the specific time frame that a compostable product has to get the certification. So if you've got a compostable product and it doesn't degrade 80 or 90% within the specified time frame, it doesn't get certified as compostable. It may then get certified as biodegradable because it is biodegradable, but its rate of degradation is too slow for it to be considered compostable.
Okay, thanks, Rod. And then I see there's another question that says, thank you so much for the talk. It was very interesting. One question, bioplastics are still produced in a factory. Is the manufacturing process more eco-friendly, or does the factory give off less carbon emissions than a conventional plastics factory?
No, I mean that the process to make a bioplastic resin is fairly similar to what needs to happen to make a traditional plastic resin. So, I mean, it's from an LCA perspective, it's probably not going to be that difference in terms of electricity usage, etc. Just on life cycle assessments, the metrics in an LCA that where traditional plastics fall over, so persistence in the environment, etc., those are still new and they're not particularly well defined. So if you do a traditional LCA on, say, a bio-based fast food container versus a polystyrene one, the polystyrene one actually looks better because it doesn't have the water usage, etc., that goes into what's needed to grow the raw materials for the bioplastics. So there's a lot of work in the LCA space around how do you properly account for persistence in the environment, because that's where the traditional plastics fall over. So yeah, you can also get in some of the food packaging and stuff, you can get the the gas type products, and those don't go through the whole complex chemical manufacturing process that is necessary to make a PLA resin or something, for instance. Those are fiber-based, and that the footprint on production for that would be a lot lower than for a bioplastic, because it's, I mean, those aren't plastic, those are fiber-based, but they don't have the same range of applications necessarily as a bioplastic would have.
Thanks, Rob. Yeah, very, very informative. I see we have gone slightly over time, but I just want to finish off with one last question. So for compostable products, they are designed with an end of life sort of purpose in mind, and that they would be turned into compost, I assume. Would that be considered downcycling? Because surely the sort of use of applications or the energy that goes into producing this product and composting it doesn't offer the same range of applications?
Look, I think, and I mean, that's it, the whole recycling, upcycling, downcycling is a fairly contentious topic. I mean, if you look at a traditional plastic, the only way you can get full circularity is through proper chemical recycling. So basically taking that plastic, chemically breaking it down to its individual monomeric units, and then repolymerizing them to form a plastic that has exactly the same properties as the original material. Mechanical recycling, even the most effective mechanical recycling, you can't mechanically recycle indefinitely. So for a PET bottle, it can maybe be turned into another PET bottle a couple of times, but then the polymer starts to degrade. So ultimately it would need to be turned into a polyester fiber, which can be used to make clothes or something. So is that downcycling? I mean, then all mechanical recycling is downcycling, and you can exclude mechanical recycling from a truly circular unless it's proper chemical recycling. So yeah, I mean, a compostable product is designed to be composted. You can say that it becomes circular because once it's composted, that compost can become substrate for growing another plant, and that plant can be turned into the raw material again. I mean, it's an argument of semantics. The compostable product is designed to be composted, but the other thing it's important to recognize is that if you have a whole lot of compostable plastic and you degrade it, you're not going to get compost, okay? Because that compostable plastic will break down into carbon dioxide and water and maybe a little bit of other components. What makes compost valuable is the cellulose, the humic, and those complex organic materials. So compostable plastics can be composted with garden waste, food waste, etc., to produce compost. But on their own, they break down to carbon dioxide and water, which has very little value to compost. So that the composting process is really an end-of-life solution to them, rather than these things contribute a lot to the compost.
Okay, so it's designed more with sort of an end-of-life goal than a circular goal. Okay.
Yes.
Okay. Very interesting. Thank you so much, Rob. I don't see any other questions at the moment, but if anyone does have questions at a later stage, you're welcome to either email Rob. His email address was there at the end of his slides, or you're welcome to contact us and we can pass those questions along. For now, just as we close off the session, I just want to say thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today, and especially special thanks to you, Rob, from all of us at SST. See you all next time. Bye-bye.